Amaron lumbered up to the growing mass of people. There were countless numbers of Arthurians now. Some had set up their tents while most had elected to rest under the open sky. Amaron surveyed the gathered crowd that stretched out as far as his dragon eyes could see. It was a truly impressive sight, but he knew it would have been more extraordinary if he could see it from the air. A twinging cramp in his right wing joint reminded him why that wasn't possible. He flexed his sore limb and ground his large teeth together from the discomfort. "Curse that winged snake," he thought as he uttered a deep rumbling growl. He had resigned himself to the fact that he was going to have to walk across the desert alongside the Arthurians. He knew that was quite capable of doing so, but he would much rather have been able to fly over the dunes instead of trudging through them. Amaron's attention was caught by a sound coming from above him. He looked up and saw Twizel and her whelpling circling him. The rosy red dragoness was flying deliberately slow so as to not outpace her son. The little green dragon was still young and not used to such long-distant flights. During the past month of their adventure, the whelpling had mostly been carried on Twizel's back along with Myra and the others. Amaron wondered if Twizel was going to continue doing so on the trek north. He called up to them in his draconic voice, a deep booming bellow that could be heard for miles. Twizel replied in the same voice. She tilted her wings to descend and landed a short distance away. The little green dragon cheekily landed on her back, flapping his wings to keep himself stable. Twizel looked over her shoulder and shook him off. The whelpling yowled incredulously at this as he jumped to the ground. "Weaning him off the piggyback rides?" asked Amaron as he strode up to them. "Starting to at any rate," Twizel replied as she looked down at her son. The whelpling chirped and yapped up at his mother, demanding to get onto her back. Twizel narrowed her eyes at him and uttered a low rumble, warning him against annoying her. The whelpling shrank away with his ears pressed back as he held his head low in submission. Twizel's expression softened as she lowered herself down and nuzzled her son. The whelpling made a happy chirp and rubbed his cheek against hers. "Are you going to make him fly over the desert by himself?" asked Amaron. Twizel stood up and looked at him with bemusement spreading across her face. "Of course not," she laughed, "I'm not going to make him do that. He's still too weak." The little dragon barked loudly in protest at hearing this. He puffed out his scaly chest and spread his wings to their full span to show just how strong he really was. "Hush," snapped Twizel. The young dragon flinched and backed away deflated. "So you're going to carry him part of the way there?" asked Amaron. "If the Arthurians don't have me flying ahead as a scout for the whole trip," answered Twizel. "Or, I wish I could join you up there," growled Amaron, "then we could share the work." "Well, seeing as you're, grounded for the duration, I guess I'll just have to pick up the slack," said Twizel. "You're not going to carry him while you're off scouting, are you?" asked Amaron. "It might be dangerous with all the djinn and sand children out there." "That's why I'll be leaving him with you while I'm off," replied Twizel. "You don't mind, do you?" "Of course not," laughed Amaron. "What are uncles for?" The little green dragon yapped and barked excitedly at this. He flapped his wings and jumped up onto Amaron's snout in a single bound. The grey bull uttered a rumbling chuckle and pulled back his lips in a toothy smile. The whelpling made a series of clacking sounds with his jaws and then chirped playfully at his uncle. Amaron snorted and reared up to his full height, rocking back on his tail to do so. He tossed his head back, throwing the little dragon into the air. The whelpling somersaulted 3 times before opening his wings and glided back around to land on Amaron's snout. "Again, again, again," he cried in his draconic voice, a series of yaps, chirps, barks and squawks. None of the Arthurians who heard him could understand a word that he said. Amaron obliged and threw his nephew into the air again and again for several minutes. This form of play was quite common among dragon youngsters. It was meant to teach them how to correct their flight paths if they ever found themselves tossed about by the wind. Amaron found himself recalling how he used to play this same game with his mother and father when he had been the whelpling's age. That time seemed so distant to him now, and he found it difficult to believe that he had ever been as small as his nephew. Amaron chuffed in amusement as he continued to play with the little green dragon. The whelpling chattered excitedly as he was flipped horns over tail. He had just opened his wings to fly back to his perch when a familiar scent filled his nostrils. He turned sharply and flew in the direction of the smell. His uncle and mother called after him and watched him go. The little dragon felt the wind rushing over his wings as he flew towards her, his beloved Myra. He could see her now, her bright red hair standing out among all the other people she was riding with. He flew over her, roaring and cawing with excitement. She waved up at him, her beautiful face beaming like the sun. The little dragon grinned from ear to ear and did a barrel roll to impress her. Several of the Arthurian youngsters who were with her laughed and cheered at his antics. Even some of the adults smiled and pointed up at him as he continued his aerial stunts. The whelpling felt his chest swell with pride as Myra gazed up at him. She was truly beautiful. Laughter bubbled up from her perfect lips and her sky-blue eyes sparkled like crystals. "I love you, I love you, I love you, Myra Greenleaf," he thought as he continued to circle over her. Amaron and Twizel watched from where they stood. They shared a look with each other and turned back to see the vanguard of the tribe of seers reaching the marshalling grounds. The multicolored banner of the all-seeing eye now joined those of the tribes that had already arrived. Horns were blown and trumpets rang as the warriors of the seers took their places beside the fighting men of the other tribes. They stood rank upon rank, standing tall with helmed heads held high. They awaited the arrival of the other tribes and their warriors. It had been decided that the armed men should leave the sanctuary first in order to ensure that the route was safe for the remainder of the people. There had been some argument over which tribe was to lead the way, but after a long and heated debate it had been agreed that the Einherjar would act as the vanguard. The warriors of the different tribes readily agreed to this, reasoning that since the Einherjar was made up from all of the tribes, no singular tribe could be accused of hoarding glory. Now the men stood patiently awaiting the rest of their comrades. Their armor and weapons glinted in the sunlight. The countless numbers of horses and other animals brayed and whinnied with excitement. The air was thick with anticipation. The little whelpling looked down on all the commotion and snorted. The smell of all the animals, people and their belongings was beginning to make his head spin. It was time to land. He tilted his wings and slowly descended, aiming for the open spot where his mother and uncle were standing. As he glided, he caught wind of another familiar scent directly below him. He looked down to see Daniel, fully clad in his new armor and riding a giant horse that made him look comically small by comparison. "Myra!" cried Daniel, waving his gloved and gauntleted hand over his helmed head. It took a moment for Myra and Asa to recognize him. He trotted up to them with a smug grin on his face. Boxer was twice as big as little Bayaz and Sia. As a result, Daniel towered over Myra and Asa as he halted next to them. "What do you think?" asked Daniel, barely able to hide the pride that was bursting from his eyes. "Of what?" replied Asa, "your new outfit or of that mountain between your legs?" "Where did you get them?" asked Myra, her wide eyes darting over both boy and horse. Daniel told him of what had happened since he got there and how he had come to own his new mount and mail. "It all happened so quickly I can barely believe it myself, and I was there," chuckled Daniel. "So what do you think, Myra? Do I look like a daring knight of yore off on a wild adventure to save some fair maiden from a wicked villain?" "I think you look ridiculous riding on that horse," said Asa. "He's way too big for you." Myra remained silent as she gazed up at Daniel. She agreed that Boxer was far too large for him, but he appeared comfortable in the saddle, another gift from old Aldred, and she was forced to admit that he did indeed look like a knight. "I think you look very regal," she answered as she looked up at him. Daniel smiled and sat just a little taller in the saddle. The whelpling heard all of this as he passed overhead. He landed on the end of Amaron's snout and immediately turned around to gaze over at them. He folded his wings and laid down, his barbed tail drooping over Amaron's left brow. "Why is she still talking to them?" he thought as he watched Myra. "Why doesn't she come over and play with me?" He scratched his chin and snorted a puff of smoke from his nostrils. He was about to stand up to fly over to her when his uncle uttered a low menacing growl. The whelpling yelped and tucked his head under his wing. As the whelpling had been watching Myra and the others, he had failed to notice Arngir approaching the group. The old Arthurian looked very displeased. Both Myra and Asa saw him coming and they could see that the man was flanked on either side by his personal housecarls. There were 5 of them in total. They were all clad in brass mail and bronze helmets and each man carried a long steel-tipped spear. Daniel saw the concern on Myra and Asa's face and glanced over his shoulder to see what had worried them. As he did so, Boxer wheeled about to confront the 5 men. Daniel gulped nervously when he saw the old man's tattooed face. They were silent for a moment. "You tricked me," Daniel finally said. "I did nothing of the kind," replied Arngir. "I merely sent you to your proper place, that's all." Daniel felt his face grow red from both embarrassment and anger. "Did you enjoy the puppet show?" asked Arngir. "I hear that all the tots are enjoying them these days." I missed the show actually, Daniel answered, making an effort to keep his voice calm. Ah, what a shame, snickered Arngir, I see you found a new horse in spite of my jest. Yeah, I found a new one, no thanks to you, said Daniel as he patted Boxer's neck. He's a bit large for you, said Arngir, but I guess you'll grow into. The old man stopped in mid-sentence as he recognized the animal. He rushed up and grabbed hold of the bridle. Boxer snorted and tried to back away, but the Arthurian's grip was too tight and he held him where he stood. Where did you get him? Snapped Arngir, answer me. Quick now. Aldred gave him to me as a gift, replied Daniel. He told me about how you stole his mare and how he kept Boxer when you wouldn't give her back. Boxer? Said Arngir with a confused look. That's the name I've given him, answered Daniel. Aldred told me that you never bothered to tell him what his name was. I've given him a new one since I don't know his old one. The old man frowned at this as he glared at Daniel. You seem to have been busy since I sent you off to the nursery, he said as he gazed at Daniel's armor. It has been a hectic half an hour, he agreed. Arngir nodded, but then he looked closer at the armor and noticed the quality of it. It took him a moment to recognize the craftsmanship. Wait a minute, I know who made that armor, he cried. How did you get the bumbling old fool to part with his wares? I've been trying to get Thorod to forge Algar a whole new set for years, but he's always refused. Now I find you wearing a hauberk and helm forged by him. Aldred introduced us, Daniel explained. And that was enough for the old cack to forge you a full set. Growled Arngir, I don't believe you. You're lying. Why would I lie to you? Asked Daniel. If anyone should be accused of lying, it's you. Insolent boy, snarled Arngir, his teeth flashing. Leave him alone, cried Myra. Go bother someone else, warned Asa. How much did Thorod charge you for the set? Arngir suddenly asked. Daniel blinked at the old man, thinking that it was an odd question to ask at such a time. I paid him 5 dwarvish marks for it, he replied. Ha, now I know you're lying to me. Arngir smiled wickedly as he held Box's bridle. What in the world are you talking about? Cried Daniel. I just told you that Thorod, a hauberk, helm and lamella vest like that would have cost you 3 times as much. Arngir interrupted. Clearly you snuck into Thorod's tent while he was sleeping off his mead and stole the armor that was meant for my grandson. Daniel was too stunned to say anything for a moment. He stared at the old man's hawkish features in dumb bewilderment. This horse is my rightful property, as is that armor, Arngir continued. Get down and take it off. Now. You're crazy, Daniel said as he pulled back on the reins. Boxer snorted and began moving backwards, straining against the old Arthurian's vice-like grip. You'll not get away. Seize him, Arngir growled. One of the brass-clad housecarls moved to pull Daniel off his horse. In response, Daniel clenched his gauntleted hand into a fist and hit the man on the head as hard as he could. What Daniel did not know was that some of Thorod's magic was still in the armor that he wore. When the steel gauntlet struck the bronze helmet, the force of the blow was doubled to twice its normal strength. The impact dazed the man as his helmet rang loudly like a bell. He dropped to his knees and groaned as he tried to remove the now severely dented headgear. At the same moment, Boxer whinnied, reared up and lashed out at his former master with his great hairy hooves. Arngir let go of the bridle and jumped back in fright. Daniel did not wait for the old man or one of his lackeys to act first. He wheeled Boxer around and thundered a short distance away. Both Myra and Asa joined him as he took refuge by one of the yurts. Arngir growled and was just about to give chase when Amaron bellowed at him. The grey dragon had heard and seen everything from where he stood. He now stomped slowly towards the old man, teeth bared and nostrils flaring. The ground shook with each of his footfalls. Do you make a habit out of annoying children, or do I just catch you at bad times? Asked Amaron as he rumbled and broiled with anger. He halted 30 feet away from the old Arthurian and stamped his right foot into the ground as hard as he could. Everything within a 300-foot radius trembled from the impact. Once again the old man appeared unconcerned with the dragon's fury and merely sneered back at him with contempt. I only accost those who have done me wrong, answered Arngir with a dismissive wave of his hand. Indeed, said Amaron as he cocked his head to one side, and yet Daniel has done nothing to you. He thrashed my grandson nearly to death, cried Arngir. Apart from that, snorted Amaron with a smirk. I already told you that Algar was trying to kill me, shouted Daniel. And you were most fortunate that he didn't, replied Arngir. Amaron spat and snarled at the old man, flames flickering from between his teeth. You will leave him alone or answer to me, rumbled Amaron. Arngir snorted a laugh and waved dismissively at the grey dragon. Whatever you say, Drac. Amaron went still at hearing the slur. What did you just call me? He asked. Drac. The old man repeated, louder this time. By now a crowd had begun to form, drawn by the commotion and heated words. They looked on at the dragon and old man, sensing the tension between them. Only madmen and fools would call me such a name to my face, said Amaron, and clearly you are both. Perhaps I am, sneered Arngir, but only a mad drac or a fool would dare to speak to me in such a manner as you have. Myra looked on, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. She was so focused on the standoff that she hardly noticed that the little whelpling had landed next to her and was pawing at her for attention. Amaron flexed his fingers and extended his curved claws out to their full length. They were 6 inches long and covered in black keratin. He bared his large white teeth and fixed his black and amber eyes onto the old man. Their eyes met and Amaron cast his bewitching spell on him. Any creature who looked into the eyes of a dragon ran the risk of coming under the dragon's power. In this state they were utterly helpless and unable to refuse any command given to them. The coins you gave to Daniel and the other boys, said Amaron, his voice a low deep rumble, where did you get it? Arngir stood unblinking for several moments as he gazed into the dragon's eye. His face seemed to grow dull for a moment as if he was falling asleep. Amaron smiled as he saw the change slowly creep over the old man. He was in his power. But then something happened that genuinely alarmed Amaron. After a moment Arngir blinked. That should not have been possible while he was under the spell. Then Arngir smiled and laughed at Amaron, slapping his knee as he stooped to catch his breath. Ooh, thank goodness. He said after he collected himself, I was worried that my immunity to your kind might have worn off since I've been in exile. You see, there are no dragons here and it's been nearly 13,000 years since I last saw one of your ilk. Amaron was stunned, but only partially. He had somewhat expected this. There were very few kinds of people who could become immune to dragon spell. Where did you get the gold to pay the werigid to Daniel and the others? Asked Amaron, already knowing the answer. Where do you think? Asked Arngir. I took that gold from a dragon's hoard after I killed the beast. Amaron roared. Fire leapt to life in the furnace of his chest and smoke rose from his flaring nostrils. Draka Sleu, he snarled in his ancient draconic language. The wrath and rage that filled his mind threatened to overwhelm him. He began to howl at the hateful old man in his native voice. P.A. Chokra, Dria Kar Drog, Kos Draka Sleu. Amaron roared in a voice so powerful and forceful that everyone who was within hearing distance cowered in fear and covered their ears. Arngir bared his teeth defiantly at Amaron and endured the harsh rebuke, a rebuke that would have broken the will of a lesser man. This made Amaron even angrier. How many of our kind did you murder? Twizel asked, walking up beside her brother. More than I can easily recall at the moment, smirked Arngir with a wicked glint in his eye. He gazed over at the little whelpling with a contemplating look and scratched his chin. I wonder if he will grow into a monster like his mother and uncle, he said, shifting his gaze back towards Amaron. Twizel sensed that Amaron was near the broiling point. Her brother glared so hatefully at the dragon slayer that she was forced to look away. She turned, scooped up her son in her claws and retreated from the scene. The whelpling yowled in protest as he was carried off. He wanted to stay by his beloved Myra. He gazed back at her, hoping that she would follow them. But to his disappointment she did not move. She sat astride Bayaz's back and watched as the old Arthurian and Amaron stared each other down. You dare call my sister and I monsters? Growled Amaron, steam rising from his nostrils. You are monsters, replied Arngir, folding his arms over his chest. You and your kind are filled with fire and bloodlust. Just look at yourself. I call you a few names and you're set to kill me. Why did you kill them? Asked Amaron, his eyes burning as he glared at the wretched old man. I could tell you that the dragons I killed had been marauding villains who burned and looted their way over half of Arthuria, replied Arngir, but that would only be true for half of the dracs I killed in my time. I am old enough to remember the feud your ilk had with the Stormlords. May they rest in peace. Until they came along, your breed were the undisputed kings of the sky. No one dared to defy you. To do so would mean death. But then the sons of Gisli Scarfoot appeared and they threw you down with lightning and thunder. They were the first to truly challenge you for supremacy of the world. They killed your kind in droves, but they knew that they couldn't do it alone. They placed bounties on your heads. I'm proud to say that I collected over 1,000 of them from the Wrath Kings while they lived and ruled. I should really be thanking you, Drac. I'm a rich man because of your kind. I carved a fortune out of your flesh. Amaron went blind with primal rage. He opened his cavernous maw and lunged forward, bellowing and roaring as he went. Arngir smiled wickedly as the grey dragon bore down on him. His goading had worked. It always did. It was all the excuse he needed. The dragon was attacking him. He would only be defending himself if he killed it now. The old Arthurian turned sharply and plucked a spear from the housecarl who stood to his right. He drew back his arm and threw the weapon like a javelin. The steel-tipped shaft flew through the air and plunged deeply into Amaron's left shoulder. The sudden pain stunned Amaron and he staggered to a halt, howling in both wrath and agony. He looked down at himself and saw the wooden shaft embedded in his flesh. He growled and bit down on the spear. He pulled it out with his teeth and held it in his mouth. Gazing at Arngir, Amaron glared and snapped the spear in two, the pieces falling to the ground with a clatter. Dark red blood began pumping from the wound. An artery had evidently been cut by the spearhead. Amaron ignored it. He knew that it was a nasty wound, but it was nowhere near bad enough to kill him. Arngir looked both amazed and frightened at the same time. Amaron lunged again and again. Arngir smiled wickedly. He plucked another spear from the housecarl who stood on his left and leveled it at the charging dragon. The old man braced himself for the impact that he knew would be tremendous. Amaron noticed the weapon too late. He ran with his open mouth at the dragon slayer and shrieked in both surprise and pain as the second steel-tipped shaft plunged into his flesh. The sharpened point buried itself in Amaron's lower jaw, just below his premolars. The roots of several teeth were destroyed and Amaron thrashed about wildly in pain. The spear stuck in his gums and Arngir was forced to let go. Amaron leapt back, yowling and roaring. The spear was sticking out of his mouth. He tried to pull it out, but the shaft broke and the head remained embedded in his now profusely bleeding gums. Amaron spat bloodied spittle at Arngir, who stood laughing up at him. The old man crossed his arms over his chest and smiled wickedly, proud of the pain that he had caused the hated beast. Amaron turned away and retreated, thundering past Myra, Asa and Danny. The youngsters were horrified by what they had seen. Now that your pets are gone, Arngir said to them, we have unfinished business to conclude. He began to advance towards them. Myra felt her magic roil angrily inside her. She thrusted her hand out and sent the old Arthurian flying backwards. He landed in a heap on top of his housecarls who collapsed under him. The crowd of onlookers shouted angrily at the old Arthurian, accusing him of being nothing more than a troublemaker and a fool for antagonizing Amaron. Arngir ignored their cries and rolled off of his bodyguards, rising to his feet. He glared hatefully at Myra, his hands clenching into fists. She had struck him. Granted, she had done so with magic, but she had sent him flying nonetheless. How dare you? He growled, do you have any idea who I am? I couldn't care less who you are, answered Myra. Arngir spluttered at this response. By now his housecarls had gotten to their feet and had taken their positions beside him. The crowd began to close in on Arngir and he felt a twinge of fear tingle the back of his neck. His housecarls moved to stand in their way, but they pressed on. The people stood cheek to jowl with Arngir's brass-clad men, pointing accusingly at him while flinging insults and curses. A pox on you, one man cried. Curse your stubbornness and misbegotten pride. A second man yelled. He's always troublesome to everyone he meets. A third man shouted. Why do we even bother to keep him around? A fourth man asked. You'll be paying that dragon a mighty big wiggild, mark my words, a fifth man called. Arngir growled at the crowd as they pressed in closer. He hated it when the peasants got uppity like this. Whenever their emotions ran high, they always forgot their proper place and dared to rebuke him. How dare they? But then he noticed that there were those in the crowd who were his equal in rank. Men of high stature whom he had fought alongside for centuries were now shouting at him. Their heated voices were mingled and confused in the uproar, but he could tell what they were saying. They accused him of bringing shame to himself and those who shared his rank. A creeping anxiety began to build in Arngir's mind as he slowly realized that he had made a huge mistake. Amaron roared and bellowed. His eyes were so full of tears that he was nearly blind. He crashed through several yurts and trampled a cart full of cabbages before he stopped his one-dragon stampede. He couldn't believe that he'd been so stupid. He should have known that the wretched old cack had been baiting him, goading him into attacking. Amaron spat out another mouthful of bloodied spittle and tried once again to pull out the spearhead. It was no use. The bladed point was embedded too deeply in his mouth for him to remove by himself. The more he tried to remove it, the more pain stabbed him. He could feel the spike had burst through his gums and was poking into the side of his tongue. Amaron kept his jaws open, fearing that he would cause more damage if he closed them. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the burning, stinging throb and the taste of his blood in his mouth. Suddenly he felt the spearhead move on its own accord. Bolts of fresh agony shocked his eyes open. He screamed as he jerked his head back. The spike seemed to resist his backward movement for a moment before it suddenly ripped out of his mouth, leaving the same way it had come. Amaron's eyes were so full of tears that he couldn't see straight for several seconds. When his vision cleared, he saw his sister standing before him, the bloodied spike clasped between her thumb and forefinger. Amaron gazed at her in silence. He breathed heavily. The pain was replaced by relief. "Thank you," he panted after a moment. She nodded. The little whelpling stood next to his mother and gazed wide-eyed up at his uncle. He watched as the wound in Amaron's shoulder continued to pump out blood at a slow but steady pace. Amaron was drooling and blood was mixed with the saliva. The smell of the plasma began to make his head feel giddy and he staggered away, rushing back to see what Myra was doing now. Amaron licked and sucked at his teeth. Several of the smaller ones had had their roots destroyed by the spearhead and fell away at the slightest touch. Amaron spat him out. He could tell that at least 3 of the larger ones were loose and needed to be removed. He looked for a large rock and found one a short distance away. He walked over to it, lowered his head, pressed his jaws against it and then began slamming his snout on the rock as hard as he could. The loud thwack that sounded from each impact made several men and women who were within earshot cringe. With each blow, Amaron could feel the offending teeth grow looser. After 5 whacks, the damaged teeth fell out of his mouth. Amaron let out a sigh of relief. He licked the spot where they had been and felt the bloodied, emptied sockets. He spat on the ground and shook his horned head. He knew that he didn't need to worry. Dragon teeth are similar to a shark's teeth. Whenever one is lost, a new one quickly grows in to fill its place. Amaron had lost hundreds in his lifetime and had yet to suffer any ill effects. By his count, he had just lost 7. He looked back towards Arngir and saw the path of destruction he had made. Amaron winced guiltily at the sight. "Did I trample anyone?" he asked. "No, you didn't step on anyone," answered Twizel. "They managed to get out of your way before you smashed their tents." Amaron nodded as he gazed at the ruined yurts. Their wooden frames and canvas skins were trashed beyond any hope of repair. Fortunately for Amaron, the Arthurians could easily replace them. Myra continued to watch as Arngir was accosted by the growing crowd. By now more than 100 people had surrounded the old man. She couldn't understand their heated voices, but she could tell that their anger for Arngir was caused by more than his actions against Amaron and Daniel. Myra later learned that Arngir was notorious for his arrogance and his overinflated sense of superiority. The common people hated him for the low esteem he had for them, while the nobles and highborn loathed him for making them look bad by association. Indeed, almost everyone within the Arthurian race detested him except only his immediate and extended family, whom he doted on. The only member of his family that didn't like him was Emmett. Myra learned much later that Arngir was once in line to become the chieftain of the tribe of Stags, but had been forced to abdicate from the line of succession due to some past scandal. The details of the scandal were unknown, having been quietly hushed up by Doin the Huntsman, the then chieftain of the tribe of Stags. Arngir had never truly gotten over the loss of power and prestige and the embarrassment that he had suffered when he had been demoted. His younger brother, Dwalin the Outrider, had taken on the mantle of chieftain while he had been forced into the role of an honored princeling. Myra could hardly imagine the history of bad blood that caused the anger as she watched the people shout and shake their fists at him. "They're certainly giving him a piece of their minds," said Asa. "And I think he fully deserves it," said Daniel, a hint of venom in his voice. Suddenly a horn was blown off in the distance and the people stopped their outcry. They stood and listened in silence. A moment passed and the sound of thundering hooves could be heard along with the tramp of marching feet. A boy came running from the outskirts of the camp, shouting and beaming with excitement. "Lord Zelinda is coming," he cried as loudly as he could. "The tribe of dragons has arrived." A cheer erupted from all the gathered Arthurians within the camp. Thousands rushed to see the arrival of their brethren and hallooed and whooped at the sight that met their eyes. Out on the grassy plains came the cavalcade of the tribe of dragons, thousands upon thousands of horsemen, all mounted on chestnut-brown steeds and clad in bright green cloaks, polished steel mail with bright helms on their heads. They were armed with long steel swords and protected by kite shields which were slung at their backs and painted green. Their banners flew in the wind and their standard-bearers rode before them, blowing their horns and trumpets to announce their arrival. At the head of the host rode Zalinda Vinson, chieftain of the tribe of dragons and the greatest warrior of his time. In appearance he looked no older than Jason Argonaut, but in reality he was over 15,000 years old. He was clad in his hauberk of riveted steel rings over which he wore his livery of brightest green. He did not have his winged helmet on at the moment as it was tied to his horse's saddle. At his left side hung Fafnir, one of the greatest war swords ever forged in Arthuria at the height of its power. Zalinda's steed was a beautiful mare named Mira, a fleet-footed filly he had loved and cherished since his childhood days. The Arthurian people cheered, clapped, whistled and sang when they saw him come into view. They loved him with all their hearts and for good reason. When they had been sold into slavery after the fall of Draco Rex, 12,000 years ago, they had languished in despair for over 3,000 years. Then Zalinda and Princess Lisa had escaped from their Pharodenic captors and fled into the desert. They had wandered for weeks until they had discovered the sanctuary. Zalinda and Lisa were the first Arthurians to enter into the protective ring of mountains that would become their people's foster home. If it had not been for the bravery of Zalinda and Princess Lisa, the Arthurians might still be enslaved to the children of the sands. Zalinda and his riders drew closer to the gathered masses. They slowed their galloping horses to a canter and rode to mingle with their brethren. "Zalinda, Zalinda!" cried the people joyfully, "the dragon men have come. Long live Zalinda Vinson! Hail to the breaker of chains! Huzzah for the prince of the dragon men! God bless the liberator of our people! Hail to the tribe of dragons! Praise the bravery of the son of Vinna! Honor to he who won our freedom! May heaven grant him his heart's desire! Hail to the wielder of Fafnir! Praise to the Lord of Dragon Roost! Honor him till his dying day! Let no man call him coward! May he win through to the end! Praise the hammer of the Phaerodonians! Hail to the Lord of the tribe of dragons! Hail him! Praise him! Honor him! Zalinda! Zalinda! The air itself was charged with excitement and filled with cheers, horn blasts and shouts of salute. Weapons clattered against shields. Zalinda smiled and rode on, waving as he passed. Men and women cried and clapped as he went by. Mothers held their little children up high so they could catch a glimpse of him. Fathers patted their sons' backs and told them about the adventures that Zalinda had gone on when he had been their age. Warriors held their weapons up in salute and smiled warmly when they saw the great chieftain draw out Fafnir from its sheath and return the gesture. Mira whinnied with excitement and tossed her head. Zalinda patted the mare's neck and reassured her that he would let her gallop as soon as everything was ready. The cavalcade of the dragon tribe followed after their chieftain, their horses whinnying and snorting as they thundered on. After the horsemen came the foot soldiers, men-at-arms, heavy and light infantry. Their numbers seemed endless. The host was truly a sight to behold. Myra looked on in awe at the vanguard of the tribe of dragons. She remembered when she and her friends had first entered the sanctuary. Jason had asked Zalinda how many Arthurians were living within it. Zalinda had answered that he wasn't sure what the total number was, but he knew that he commanded over 5 million fighting men. Myra had not seen Zalinda since the end of the battle with the dragon witches and basilisks. The reason for this was because he had ridden south shortly after the two surviving winged snakes had carried their mistresses away. He had been gathering his people and their belongings for the long trek north. Myra watched in amazement as more and more green-clad Arthurians made their way towards the marshalling grounds. She was gazing so intently at Zalinda's tribe that she didn't notice that both the tribe of wolves, stags and bears were marching and riding alongside them. Lingtra's cobalt blue banner flew next to Kala's crimson flag while Emmet's gold and yellow standard blew in the wind alongside them. The three chieftains rode closely together a little ways behind Zalinda. They smiled and waved at the people as they passed. "This is just how I imagined it would be." Lingtra laughed in his native tongue. "Oh, I believe you, little brother," replied Kala. "I've been having dreams about today ever since the battle at Hovel's Well. You know, even though we've spent so many years cooped up in this place, I've grown rather fond of it," said Emmet. "Are you fond of it enough to stay behind?" asked Lingtra with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Not on your life," cried Emmet. Both Lingtra and Kala laughed and rode on. A short distance behind him trotted an odd beastly trio. The gigantic black bear called Ursi lumbered along while he was flanked on either side by a huge wolf. The wolf on his right had a rich black coat of fur and was named Farkas. The wolf on Ursi's left was brown in color and named Lockyer. Ursi was the lifelong companion of Carla, while Farkas and Lockyer were Lingtras. The beasts were immortal like their Arthurian masters, and after the fall of Draco Rex they had been forced into exile alongside them. They had endured the long dry years, dreaming of the day when they would return to their rightful place in the world with their Arthurian friends. Ursi grunted and growled while Farkas and Lockyer howled for joy. Even though they were animals, they understood what was happening and knew why all of the tribes were gathering in one spot. Home. We're going home, they thought as they followed after their masters. The beast smiled as a rider who was mounted on a chestnut-brown horse rushed by them. The horseman was Jason Argonaut that was mounted on the stallion Uhtred. Jason reined in his steed to a canter and rode alongside the three chieftains. He was wearing his militia uniform with his flak vest and M1 helmet. His rifle and submachine gun were sheathed in their saddle holsters on either side of Uhtred. By now the cheering had died down to an excited buzz. Jason rubbed his left shoulder and winced. The wound that Byzantium had given him was healing remarkably quickly, but it was still felt very sore. I hope Mercy doesn't make me drink any more of that stuff, he said to himself, recalling the sour salty potion that the chieftain of the tribe of doves had given to him. Jason shuddered at the thought. You alright? Asked Ling Tra. Yeah, I'm fine, my shoulder's just aching a bit, replied Jason. You're a lucky one, you know that, said Carla. You're the first person that Byzantium's basilisk has ever dropped, said Emmett. You must have put up quite a fuss for that to have happened, laughed Carla. Well, I guess shooting it in the groin helped in that regard, said Jason. All three of the Arthurians cringed at hearing this. It was either that or keep going up, said Jason, and I have this thing with heights. As he spoke he looked up at the towering cliffs that loomed over him. He gulped nervously as he gazed at the narrow pathway that zigzagged its way up to the top. Speaking of which, are we going to climb over that to get out of here? He asked as he pointed up at it. The three chieftains chuckled at this and shook their heads. No, of course not, chuffed Carla. That would take forever and a day, smiled Emmett. Then how are we going to get all these people out of the sanctuary? Asked Jason. You'll see, Master Argonaut, you'll see soon enough, laughed Ling Tra. Jason wanted to ask more, but then he heard his name being called out. He turned to see Myra and Asa waving at him. He waved back and turned Uhtred towards them. When he reached them he saw the worried looks on their faces. He asked them what was wrong and they told him about Arngir and his actions against Daniel and Amaron. He what? Cried Jason. He's crazy, said Asa. I think he really wanted to kill Amaron, said Myra. Where is that overgrown lizard anyway? Asked Jason. Over there, pointed Asa. Daniel and Twizel are with him. Jason looked to where Asa had indicated and saw Amaron reclining on the ground next to his sister. It took Jason a moment to recognize Daniel with his new armor on. Oh brother, sighed Jason, he's gone native. Not yet, said Myra, but it won't be long until he's speaking Arthurian. Indeed, he's well on his way to becoming one of us, said a voice from behind her. Myra turned to see Strath standing there. The blind man was gazing at her with his unseeing eyes and smiling warmly. You and Asa better make your way to Her Highness, said Strath, she'll want to speak with you before we go. Then he turned to Jason and said, you had better go with them as well. Princess Lisa has something for you. What does she have for me? Asked Jason. Why ruin the surprise? Smiled Strath as he smiled and turned away. I hate surprises, Jason muttered under his breath. The three of them rode through the crowd. Their going was slow. The Arthurians crowded around them and reached out their hands to touch Myra and Asa. Many of them had tears welling in their eyes. They kept repeating the word "tack" over and over again, thanking the boy and girl who had been foretold by Draco Rex. The people had waited so long for this day to come, and now it was finally here. At long last they were allowed to return home, and they were overcome by their emotions because of it. Myra and Asa did their best to keep moving, but it was difficult. Bayaz and Sia whinnied and snorted as the people pressed in around them. The ponies didn't like being crowded at all. When a gap appeared, both animals trotted out of the mass of people as fast as their riders would let them. Jason and Uhtred were right behind them. Soon the three found themselves at the very base of the high cliffs. The Einherjar were gathered there, rank upon rank, regiment upon regiment. They faced towards the cliff, their heads looking up at a tumbled pile of boulders. Myra, Asa and Jason followed their gaze and saw that both Captain Dowras and Princess Lisa were standing on top of one of the higher rocks. The master of the Einherjar Guard wore his finest steel hauberk and long silver cloak. His head was clad in his winged commander's helmet, gilded with gold and silver inlay. He held his steel-tipped spear in his right hand and his steel shield in his left. His sword hung sheathed at his left side. Princess Lisa stood next to him, but she was no longer wearing her fine dress but was clad in armor. She wore a gilded coat of plates, steel pauldrons and polished vambraces along with brass greaves and gauntlets. On her head was her gold and silver circlet beset with 10 gems, each colored stone representing the 10 tribes of Arthuria. She had a long thin-bladed sword sheathed at her side, the same sword she had used to kill the witch Jessica before she could harm Myra. The people below looked up at her and murmured when they saw the way their princess was dressed. They recognized the armor that she was wearing. It had belonged to her brother, Prince Yolan the Uncrowned, who had been slain by their father, King Moribund, during the fall of Draco Rex. Many of the Arthurians were amazed to see their princess clad in such attire. Lisa had never been a fighter like her late brother and had in fact been lauded as one of the most peace-loving princesses Arthuria had ever had. Now, however, she looked like a shield maiden. Some of the older Arthurians recalled her 7 times great-grandmother, Queen Rila the Lioness, who had been one of the greatest shield maidens who had ever lived. If she is 1/10 as fierce as her famed ancestor, then nothing shall stand before us. Some of the older Arthurians whispered amongst themselves. Myra was in awe as she gazed up at the Arthurian princess. She looked both beautiful and ferocious. Lisa surveyed her gathered people. Such a host of Arthurians had not been seen since the fall of Draco Rex. She felt her heart fluttering with excitement, anticipation and fear. Lisa knew there would be no turning back once she and her people set out to reclaim their homeland. A little thought wormed its way into the back of her mind. Why not stay in the sanctuary? She and her people were safe within its protective ring and there was plenty of room for everyone. The little idea seemed to be a reasonable one, but Lisa cast it from her mind before it could take root and grow. She knew that idea hadn't originated in her brain but from another source entirely. "You will not trick me, deceiver," she thought as she gazed out over her people. "My followers have endured their exile for long enough. We are going home and there is nothing you or your jinn can do to stop us." An angry wind blew around her for a short moment and then dissipated. Lisa let out a sigh of relief. She looked towards Captain Dowras and nodded. He returned the nod and stepped forward. He banged his spear on the rock 3 times and the hushed murmuring coming from the Arthurians was stilled. Everyone looked up at Lisa and waited. The Princess of Arthuria raised both of her hands and held them out in front of her. "All of us have waited for this day ever since we learned of its coming," she said. "When we broke the back of the Farodine Empire and established ourselves in this sanctuary, we believed that we would never set foot on Arthuria again. My father banished us to this place because we remained faithful to Draco Rex. By the laws and customs of our people, we are honor-bound to follow the commandments of our king, even though he sided against us. We believed that we would remain in exile forever. But when we were giving ourselves up to despair, a miracle occurred. For those of us who were there on that day, it was truly a blessing sent by the All-Wise himself. Celeste the Dragon Queen, the wife of Draco Rex, appeared before us. She comforted us by saying that her husband was not dead as we first believed but was asleep. She told us that by his wish she had hidden him away from the world so that he might heal himself from the wounds he received at the hands of the great deceiver. After she told us these things, she gave us a command to follow. She ordered us to remain here in the sands and not to return to Arthuria until the 2 children foretold by her husband appeared among us. When she gave us this order, she blessed us and disappeared. She has never been seen by us since that day. We have followed her commandment faithfully for 12,000 years, but now the day has come. Myra Allison Greenleaf and Asa Draconis have come to us at last. On this day we begin our journey home." A cheer erupted from the gathered multitude. As Myra continued to gaze up at Lisa, she thought to herself, "Yes, that's right. I have to find the Dragon Queen along with the Dragon King. I almost forgot about her," Asa thought, transmitting his idea to Myra's mind by using his magic. Myra turned to him and returned the mental signal by thinking, "We'll find them. I don't know how, but somehow I know we will." Asa nodded and turned back to Lisa. "The journey ahead of us will be a long and difficult one," said the Arthurian princess. "To reach the Blessed Realm we must first cross the ever-shifting sands and then sail over the sundering sea. Toil and hardship await us beyond our protective ring of mountains. Enemies both new and old will hound and harass us as we march north. I fear that much blood will be spilt before we reach our home. But with the aid of the All-Wise we will endure the trails that lay ahead. After being away for so long I am ready to go home to Arthuria. Arthuria, roared the people in a deafening joyful voice. Jason Argonaut, Lisa suddenly cried, step forward. Jason was surprised by this and remained still for a moment, but then Carla, with a mischievous smile on his face, slapped Uhtred's rump. The horse snorted and clopped forward. By the time Jason halted he was before the crowd. He could feel their countless eyes boring holes into the back of his helmeted head. Jason gazed up at Princess Lisa, not knowing what he should do next. Finally, after a second of debating with himself, he decided that he should salute her. "Why yes, Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling slightly with stage fright. "You are the guardian and protector of Myra Greenleaf, is that not correct?" asked Lisa. "I am," said Jason. "I have also been informed that you have been instructing my people how to properly use modern weaponry," said Lisa as she looked down at him. "That is true, Your Highness," replied Jason. "How many of my people have you taught?" she asked. "I'd say around 150, answered Jason. "They were Lingtra's housecarls." "Indeed?" said Lisa. She turned to the leader of the tribe of wolves and said, "And has Master Argonaut been a good or bad teacher to your men, my lord?" "Your Grace, I am pleased to say that Jason has been exemplary in his instructions to my men," said Lingtra, "although some of the higher-ranked members of my people have voiced their concern over being ordered about by a mere private." "Who said that?" Jason asked out loud before he could stop himself. Some of the Arthurians within earshot of him chuckled at this. "In that case I will put their concerns to rest," said Lisa. She stepped down off the rocks and turned towards Jason, drawing out her sword. "Kneel," she commanded. Jason hesitated at first before he dismounted Uhtred and did as he was told. "Jason Spencer Argonaut of the Agro Caelestes," said Lisa, "you are a lowly private no longer. I hereby dub thee as my personal advisor. Your tasks are simple. You must advise me in all things concerning modern warfare. I entrust you with teaching my fighting men, both high and low born. And to ensure that there will be no undue grumbling, I promote you to the rank of captain." Jason looked up in bewilderment. He couldn't believe it. He gaped speechlessly at Lisa for several moments before he remembered his manners and thanked her for the honors. "I trust that you will perform all your tasks faithfully, both to me and to Myra," said Lisa. "I shall try my best to do so, my lady," replied Jason as he bowed his head. Lisa smiled at him and turned toward Myra and Asa. Both of the youngsters had dismounted their steeds and were watching the dubbing with great interest. Myra was practically beaming with pride for her legal guardian. Lisa beckoned him to approach her. Myra and Asa did as they were requested and stood before the Arthurian princess. "You two have an important task to perform," she said to them. "Aside from finding Draco Rex?" asked Myra. Lisa smiled warmly at her. "That is your main task, but it shall wait for the moment," said the Arthurian princess. She led him to the base of the wall where a crack had formed. Lisa instructed him to peer into it, and when they did so they saw light coming from the other end. "This crack is how we are going to leave the sanctuary," said Lisa. "How? It's barely an inch wide," cried Asa. "You want us to use our magic to make it wider," said Myra as she gazed up at Lisa. The Arthurian woman smiled and nodded her head. "Place your hands on either side of the rift and focus your power on it," she instructed. Myra and Asa did so, but then they noticed that there were many other handprints worn into the rock. "My people think that touching this seam will bring them good fortune," explained Lisa. "Let's hope that it proves true for all of us." Myra and Asa glanced at each other before turning their attention toward the rift. "Now all together, push," said Lisa. Myra and Asa pressed their hands against the stone as hard as they could. For a moment it didn't budge, but then there was a loud boom that echoed out over the gathering grounds. The stone began to yield outward. The crack grew bigger and wider, racing towards the top of the cliff. Small stones were dislodged and came cascading down the rock face. Myra jumped back as she watched the towering cliffs swing slowly outward like a gigantic set of double doors. Her eyes were wide in astonishment and her heart raced in her chest. The ground shook under her feet and the air was filled with a terrific growling sound as stone grinded against stone. Boulders the size of automobiles were dislodged by the titanic movement and tumbled down the incline, disintegrating as they smashed into one another. By the time they reached the ground, they were no bigger than pebbles. The Cyclopean doors continued to open wider and wider and wider. The people looked on in awe and saw the desert dunes beyond the opening. The doors slowly moved on until they suddenly came to a halt with a shuddering crash and a thundering boom. A gap over 1,000 feet wide had been opened, exposing the grassy plains of the sanctuary to the arid wastes of the endless sands. Myra and Asa shared a bewildered look as they gazed out at the dunes. "Did we really just do that?" thought Myra. "I didn't think we could move something that big." Asa replied, "Maybe the door was already magical and just needed a little shove to get going," offered Myra. "That must be it," Asa agreed. "I thought I could sense some power in the stone, but I wasn't certain until now." Jason had looked on from where he stood in sheer disbelief. There was simply no possible way that Myra and Asa could have opened those huge doors by themselves. He shifted his gaze and looked towards the enormous slabs to see where they were connected to the rest of the wall. He expected to see titanic doorposts and huge metal hinges, but instead he saw nothing but rock, twisted and warped as though it had been made out of putty. "What in the?" Jason began to say under his breath, but his amazement stilled his voice and he went quiet. He gaped in silence at the sight and at the implications of the feat. He had seen Myra move things with only a gesture and heal wounds with a touch. Jason recalled how at the beginning of their adventure Mr. Goatman had said that she was the most powerful magical person currently alive. He hadn't truly understood what that had meant. But now, after seeing the apparent ease with which the youngsters had opened the gates, he was beginning to rethink the whole thing. If Myra could do this, then what else was she capable of? He stared at the back of her red-haired head in stunned awe. Princess Lisa turned towards her people with her hands held high. "It is done," she said in a loud voice. "The wall that has long protected us from our enemies is at last breached. This land, our foster home, is a sanctuary no longer. It is now nothing more than a stone pen. If we remain here, then our foes would flood in through this gap and carry us away to slavery and torment. We shall not wait for them to appear, but will instead depart this realm, leaving behind all our grazing lands and watering holes to the sons of the Farodine. Let it be a werrygit to they who have long desired the fertile country for themselves. Today is the end of our realm in exile. Let us now go home. Home."